She was born into the soft hills and wild forests of Bavaria, a carefree child with wind-blown hair and muddy feet, never destined, nor prepared, for the suffocating weight of a throne. Yet fate, with its cruel sense of irony, would place her at the heart of one of Europe's most powerful empires. Empress Elisabeth of Austria, known to the world as Sisi, has been immortalized in paintings, poems, and period dramas as the embodiment of elegance and tragedy. Her image, graceful, distant, adorned in shimmering gowns with cascading chestnut hair, remains a symbol of royal glamour. But what lies behind the portrait, behind the myth, behind the melancholy smile? This is not a fairy tale. This is the story of a woman who wandered through palaces like a ghost, who turned away from cameras and court life, who sought freedom in anonymous hotel rooms and mountain trails, who read Shakespeare by candlelight and penned verses no one was meant to read. A woman who traveled endlessly, not in search of glory, but in desperate pursuit of peace. Sisi's life was filled with contradictions. She was worshipped by the public, but repelled by attention. She had palaces at her feet, yet felt imprisoned by golden walls. She had admirers across Europe, but few true companions. The tragedy of her life was not one dramatic moment. It was the slow, aching unraveling of a spirit that could not breathe beneath the weight of expectation. Her travels were not simply royal tours. They were acts of resistance. Every train ticket, every ship she boarded, every pseudonym she used was a small rebellion against the world that tried to define her. She wrote poetry in secret, obsessed over her appearance as if perfection might shield her from scrutiny, and mourned deeply the losses that shaped her path, especially the death of her son Rudolph, whose fate mirrored her own despair. What made Elizabeth flee? What did she seek in her endless wanderings, from Corfu to Geneva, from the Alps to the Mediterranean? Was it beauty, solitude, truth? And in the end, did she ever find what she was looking for? Her story is not simply one of royal hardship or personal sadness. It is the portrait of a soul in exile. It is the life of a woman who wore a crown, but longed to be invisible. A woman who was admired, but never truly known. Welcome to Words of Time. In this video, we delve deep into the life of Empress Elisabeth of Austria, not as a romanticized icon of a bygone era, but as a complex, restless, and fiercely human figure. Join us as we uncover the secrets behind her constant travels, her intellectual solitude, her silent griefs, and the freedom she chased until her final breath. This is The Lonely Wanderer, A Life Unfulfilled. Empress Elisabeth of Austria, often remembered as the fairy tale empress, captured the imagination of generations with her ethereal beauty, lavish lifestyle, and almost mythical public image. Her portraits, especially those by the celebrated artist Franz Xaver Winterhalter, depict her draped in silks and diamonds, with her impossibly long hair styled in exquisite braids and adorned with stars. From the outside, hers was a life most could only dream of: palaces, ballrooms, and imperial splendor. She was married to Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria, traveled through the great courts of Europe, and was celebrated as one of the most enchanting women of her time. Yet beneath this glittering exterior, there lay a life far more complex, troubled, and ultimately tragic than the fairy tale suggested. From a young age, Elizabeth, or Sisi as she was affectionately called by her family, was not molded for the world of courts and protocols. She was born into the Bavarian Wittelsbach family, known for its eccentricity and love of freedom. Raised in a relatively informal and relaxed household, she spent her youth surrounded by nature, animals, and poetry. She enjoyed horseback riding, hiking, and a level of autonomy unthinkable for many noble girls of her era. Her mother, Ludovica, was of royal blood but had little power or prestige. Sisi's carefree upbringing in Possenhofen Castle gave her a deep love of liberty and an enduring distaste for constraints, expectations, and court etiquette. This aversion would later clash violently with her new life after marrying Franz Joseph at the age of 16. Initially intended for her elder sister Helene, Franz Joseph fell in love with the younger Elizabeth almost instantly. Their engagement and subsequent marriage were celebrated across the empire as the joining of beauty and power. But what appeared to be the beginning of a charmed life was, in truth, the start of Elizabeth's lifelong imprisonment in what she would come to see as a gilded cage. The imperial court in Vienna was notorious for its rigidity. Governed by a web of rules, traditions, and relentless scrutiny, it demanded total conformity and allowed no room for the individuality that Sisi so cherished. The mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, wielded immense influence and power, often undermining Sisi's role not just as empress, but even as a mother. Sophie took control of Elizabeth's children, refusing her input on their upbringing. Her firstborn daughter Sophie died tragically young, and Elizabeth was blamed for the illness that led to the child's death. This event haunted her throughout her life, adding a profound layer of grief and guilt to her inner world. More than just a clash of personalities, the conflict between Sisi and the court highlighted the stark contrast between the romantic ideals of youth and the brutal realities of imperial life. Where she had once wandered freely through forests, she now found herself trapped in a palace where every step was watched, every word weighed, and every choice judged. Her beauty, so admired by the public, became both armor and burden. She was expected to maintain an impossibly high standard of appearance, leading her to adopt extreme regimens of diet and exercise. She would fast, bind herself tightly in corsets, and spend hours on her hair and skin treatments. Her obsession with staying young and thin was more than vanity. It was her rebellion against a life she could not control. By mastering her body, she sought to reclaim at least one realm of autonomy. Yet even her legendary beauty could not shield her from the mental and emotional toll of her existence. Elizabeth suffered from bouts of depression, alienation, and anxiety, which were exacerbated by her physical ailments and emotional isolation. She began to distance herself more and more from the court, traveling constantly, often under assumed names. These journeys were not mere vacations but escapes, desperate flights from the suffocating environment of Vienna. She found solace in Hungary, where she was genuinely loved by the people and where her friendship with Count Eula Andressy flourished. Some speculate that their bond may have gone beyond platonic affection, though no conclusive evidence supports this. What is undeniable is that in Hungary, Sisi felt seen, appreciated, and above all, free. Her relationship with Franz Joseph was complicated. Though he remained deeply devoted to her throughout his life, Elizabeth struggled to reciprocate with the same intensity. He represented the structure she so deeply resented, and while she respected him as a ruler and a man of duty, she could not fully embrace her role as his consort. The emotional distance between them grew over time. They spent increasing periods apart, with Sisi often abroad while Franz Joseph remained rooted in Vienna. Their correspondence, though cordial and affectionate, reflected the emotional chasm that had widened between them. Motherhood, too, was a source of anguish. Besides the tragic loss of her first daughter, her son Rudolph's life and death were pivotal in shaping the Empress's later years. Rudolph, the crown prince, was highly intelligent and sensitive, qualities that made him ill-suited for the militaristic and conservative world of the Habsburg dynasty. He struggled with personal demons, political frustrations, and a sense of hopelessness about his future. His suicide at Mayerling in 1889, along with his lover Baroness Mary Vetsera, was a scandal and a devastating personal loss for Elizabeth. It deepened her already profound melancholy and reinforced her belief in the futility of life and the cruelty of fate. After Rudolph's death, Elizabeth adopted an increasingly withdrawn and nomadic existence. She wore black for the rest of her life, not just as a mourning for her son, but as a symbol of her spiritual death. She refused to sit for any new portraits, avoiding mirrors and cameras. She continued her travels, accompanied only by a small circle of confidants, leaving behind an empire she had never truly embraced. Her writings during this time, particularly her poems, reveal a tortured soul grappling with existential despair. She wrote extensively about death, nature, and the desire to escape. Her fascination with Greek culture, mythology, and philosophy became more pronounced, and she spent long periods in Corfu, where she built the Achillaion Palace as a tribute to her favorite hero, Achilles. Here, she sought not the luxury of an imperial retreat, but the silence and solitude that had always eluded her. Despite her reclusiveness, Elizabeth remained an iconic figure, romanticized by the public and mythologized in literature and film. Her death, too, seemed to align with the tragic narrative of her life. In 1998, while in Geneva, she was assassinated by an Italian anarchist named Luigi Lucchini. The attack was not personal. He had simply wanted to kill a royal figure to make a political statement. At the time of the assault, Elizabeth was traveling incognito, walking along the lake promenade with her lady-in-waiting. Lucchini stabbed her with a sharpened file, and though she initially seemed unscathed, she collapsed shortly afterward and died from internal bleeding. Her final moments, in many ways, encapsulated the contradictions of her life. a queen who sought anonymity, a woman of immense influence who died far from her court, unrecognized by the very public that adored her. The story of Empress Elisabeth is not simply one of beauty, wealth, or even personal sorrow. It is a reflection of how roles and expectations, especially for women in powerful positions, can distort and imprison the individual spirit. While the world saw a dazzling empress with unmatched elegance, what lay beneath was a woman constantly at war with herself and her surroundings. Her defiance, whether in choosing her own path, embracing Hungarian nationalism, or rejecting the rituals of imperial life, made her a uniquely modern figure. She was not content to play the part assigned to her. She sought to redefine it, even if that meant living a life of exile within her own skin. Elizabeth's story resonates even today, not because she was perfect, but because she was painfully human. Her struggles with body image, mental health, societal expectations, and personal grief are timeless. In many ways, she anticipated the challenges that women in the public eye continue to face. The tension between public persona and private self, between duty and desire, between image and identity. These are battles that transcend centuries. The legacy of the fairy tale empress is thus a complex tapestry of glamour and sorrow. While the glittering portraits in romantic films continue to captivate audiences, the real Elizabeth remains elusive, both a symbol and a shadow. Her life invites us to question the cost of perfection and the meaning of freedom. What does it mean to be truly seen? To be truly loved? To live on your own terms in a world that demands conformity? Perhaps the greatest irony is that in trying to escape her life, Elizabeth ended up defining it. Her travels, her silences, her poems, and even her rebellion were all acts of assertion, expressions of an identity that refused to be erased by a title. In the end, Elizabeth was not just an Empress of Austria, she was an Empress of contradictions. A woman who lived within a palace yet was forever searching for home, who was crowned in gold but longed for the simplicity of wildflowers and mountain air. The golden cage she inhabited was real, both physically and metaphorically. It was made of duty, tradition, expectation, and pain. But it also contained within it a spark of resistance, a yearning that would not die. And in that, Elizabeth remains not just a figure of history, but a mirror for all who have ever felt trapped by the roles they are forced to play. Her story is not a fairy tale. It is a parable, a caution, and above all, a testament to the enduring struggle for authenticity in a world that often demands a mask. Elisabeth of Bavaria, who would become the Empress of Austria and Queen of Hungary, entered the Habsburg court as a young girl barely past her 16th birthday. Her marriage to Emperor Franz Joseph was hailed across the empire as a perfect union. A handsome and dutiful ruler joined in matrimony with a radiant beauty of noble birth. But from the moment she set foot in the imperial palace of Vienna, Elizabeth, affectionately known as Sisi, began to feel the burden of a crown that, while glittering with privilege, weighed heavily upon her spirit. Raised in the relatively relaxed and free-spirited environment of the Bavarian countryside, Sisi was ill-prepared for the suffocating rigidity of Habsburg court life. What awaited her behind the grand facades and ceremonial fanfare was a world governed by strict codes of conduct, centuries-old traditions, and a level of surveillance and control that left little room for individuality. The Habsburg court was perhaps one of the most ceremonial and rule-bound courts in Europe. Every gesture, word, and interaction was governed by an elaborate protocol meant to reflect the grandeur and permanence of the imperial dynasty. Titles were not merely honorifics but barriers. Conversations followed rigid hierarchies. Even eye contact could be limited by one's rank or position. There were official walking orders, seating arrangements, and greeting rituals that had to be followed with precision. Mistakes, however small, were not taken lightly. Into this stifling environment came a teenager who had been used to running through meadows barefoot, feeding animals at her family's estate, and writing verses in solitude under the Bavarian sky. Sisi's arrival in Vienna was a cultural collision. Her spontaneity, her desire for privacy, her dislike of formalities, these were all seen as eccentric at best and insulting at worst. Her husband, Franz Joseph, though kind and loyal in many ways, was a creature of habit and duty, entirely molded by the expectations of monarchy. While he adored Sisi, he did little to shield her from the harsh scrutiny of court life. It was his mother, Archduchess Sophie, who became Sisi's most consistent antagonist. Sophie, who had effectively ruled the empire during Franz Joseph's early reign, believed in discipline, order, and tradition above all else. She saw Sisi as immature, unsuitable, and perhaps worst of all, unwilling to conform. Sisi's struggles began almost immediately after her wedding. She was expected to appear at endless ceremonies, receptions, and state functions, always dressed in the most extravagant attire, always composed, always smiling. Her every move was watched by courtiers, chronicled in newspapers, and discussed in salons. She was not allowed to raise her own children, as Sophie took control of their upbringing, citing Sisi's youth and inexperience. This was not merely a personal insult, it struck at the very heart of her identity. Losing control over her role as a mother deepened her sense of alienation and planted the seeds of a lifelong distrust toward the Viennese court. Public appearances, which to many royal figures were part of their duty and public affection, became for Sisi an ordeal. She did not enjoy being the center of attention in settings where she felt objectified rather than understood. Unlike her husband, who was at ease giving speeches, greeting dignitaries, and playing the part of a ruler, Sisi often seemed to disappear emotionally even as she stood physically present. She began to dread these occasions and withdrew from many of them over time, citing illnesses or traveling abroad to avoid them altogether. Yet Sisi was no idle recluse. Her absences from court were not simply escapes, but also acts of silent rebellion. Deprived of control over her children, her schedule, and her surroundings, she sought to regain authority over the few things she could claim as her own. Her body, her mind, and her inner world became domains she guarded fiercely. She threw herself into the disciplines of physical exercise, riding, beauty routines, and writing. These activities were more than hobbies. They were strategies of resistance against a life she had not chosen. Horse riding became her sanctuary. In an era when royal women were expected to be demure and dainty, Sisi took to the saddle like a warrior. She became one of the finest equestriennes in Europe, capable of riding for hours at high speeds, often choosing dangerous terrain that would challenge even seasoned male riders. She rode almost every day, regardless of weather. Her preference for Hungarian horses and country trails was more than aesthetic. It reflected her deepening bond with Hungary, a land whose people appreciated her and whose customs gave her more room to breathe. Riding allowed her to be in motion, in control, and away from the stifling corridors of Habsburg Palace. Her obsession with beauty and appearance also intensified as her dissatisfaction with her life grew. She was determined to maintain her youthful figure and appearance, not out of sheer vanity, but because she saw her beauty as both a form of power and a mask. She adhered to a strict diet, sometimes surviving on little more than milk and fruit. Her waist was famously tiny, held in by tightly laced corsets that she insisted on wearing even during travel. Her hair, which fell below her knees, required several hours of care each day. She had a dedicated hairdresser who worked in silence to maintain the Empress's trademark style, as any unnecessary conversation could irritate Sisi and disrupt the meditative calm she sought during these rituals. Beauty for her was not just about allure. It was about control in a world where she had almost none. Even her poetry was a means of resistance. Sisi wrote in private, using verse as an outlet for feelings she could not express openly. Her poems often reflected her melancholy, her longing for freedom, her disillusionment with royalty, and her fascination with death. Unlike the formal, propagandist writings expected of royals, her poetry was deeply personal, reflective, and at times defiant. She admired romantic and philosophical poets, particularly Heinrich Heine, whose irony and skepticism resonated with her own view of the world. In these writings, one can trace the emotional map of a woman struggling to reconcile the expectations of her role with the yearnings of her soul. Her physical appearance, so worshipped by her subjects, became both her armor and her prison. She did not allow new portraits after the age of 30, believing that the public should remember her at the peak of her beauty. She began to cover her face with fans and parasols, especially when in public, to avoid being seen up close. There was an increasing sense that she no longer belonged to herself, that her image had been stolen and turned into a myth that bore little resemblance to the real Elizabeth. She feared the slow decay of aging not only for the usual reasons, but because she believed that as her beauty faded, so too would her value in the eyes of the world. This fear was not unfounded. In a court where women were often judged solely on their appearance and ability to bear heirs, the loss of youth could mean the loss of relevance. Despite her aloofness, or perhaps because of it, Sisi became an object of fascination. Her elusiveness, combined with her known eccentricities, created an aura of mystery that captivated the public. The fewer public appearances she made, the more intensely people wanted to see her. Her reclusiveness was not seen as arrogance, but as a tragic symbol of a woman out of place in her own time. She came to embody a kind of romantic sorrow that people projected their own dreams and disappointments onto. The fairy tale, instead of being shattered by her resistance, only deepened. But for Sisi herself, this was a deeply lonely existence. Her increasingly nomadic lifestyle was another expression of her desire to reclaim freedom. She traveled constantly, often under pseudonyms, accompanied by a small retinue. She visited spas, remote castles, and ships, always searching for a place where she might feel at peace. Her favorite destinations included the Greek island of Corfu, where she eventually built the Achillaion Palace, dedicated to the Greek hero Achilles, whom she revered for his beauty, strength, and tragic fate. Her connection to Greek culture reflected her longing for an ancient world that she believed had been more in tune with truth, nature, and honor. In Corfu, she could walk alone, study languages, and immerse herself in classical literature, activities that brought her some measure of solace. Though she remained empress in name and title, Elizabeth was largely absent from the political and ceremonial life of the empire. She refused to play the role of the gracious hostess, the charitable matron, or the obedient consort. And yet, when she did involve herself in politics, she did so with great effect. Her advocacy for Hungary, especially during the negotiations leading up to the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of the year 1867, earned her genuine respect and admiration. The Hungarians saw her not as an imperial symbol, but as a true friend. She learned their language, wore their national dress, and spent extended periods in Budapest. In Hungary, she was not merely tolerated, she was loved. Her ability to influence political outcomes when she chose to intervene proves that her detachment was not due to incapacity but choice. Elizabeth could, and did, rise to the occasion when it mattered most to her. But she refused to be a puppet, and she would not perform the daily rituals of power that had no meaning for her. She lived according to her own rhythms, and that choice, rare for any royal figure, especially a woman, came at the cost of deep isolation. Even in her death, Elizabeth remained true to the themes that had shaped her life. She was assassinated in the year 1898 by an Italian anarchist while walking along the promenade in Geneva. At the time of the attack, she was unaccompanied by guards and was traveling incognito, dressed modestly and without royal insignia. The assassin, who had intended to target a different member of royalty, stabbed her through the chest with a sharpened file. Though the wound initially seemed superficial, it pierced her heart, and she died shortly afterward. Her passing shocked the world, not only because it was violent and sudden, but because it brought to an end a life that had long felt like a fading legend. Her funeral was grand, as befitted an empress, but Elizabeth had already transcended the role long before she was laid to rest. She had become a symbol of longing, of resistance, and of the personal cost of monarchy. The weight of the crown, for Sisi, had never been one of diamonds or velvet. It had been the relentless pressure to conform, to smile, to obey, and to disappear behind a facade that others had chosen for her. She fought against that weight with every means available to her, with silence, with travel, with art, with endurance. In the centuries that followed, Elizabeth's story has continued to be retold, reimagined, and revered. But beyond the dresses and palaces, beyond the scandals and beauty, what remains is the image of a woman who sought freedom in a world that denied it at every turn. Hers was not a rebellion of fire and fury, but one of quiet, relentless refusal. In every missed event, every hidden poem, every horseback ride into the wilderness, she carved out a space for her true self, even if that space was fleeting. Elizabeth's life is a testament to the unseen burdens that accompany great privilege. It challenges us to reconsider the lives of those we place on pedestals, to ask what lies beneath the rituals and roles that history assigns. For beneath the crown was a woman who longed simply to be free. Elizabeth of Austria, often remembered for her breathtaking beauty and mysterious life, carried with her a sorrow that shaped her role not only as empress but also as a mother. At the core of her personal grief and growing emotional isolation was the early and devastating loss of her first child, a daughter named Sophie. This event would forever alter her relationship with her remaining children and cast a long, dark shadow over her understanding of motherhood. The pain of losing Sophie was not only a personal tragedy. It marked the beginning of a lifelong conflict between Elizabeth and the structures of the Habsburg court, particularly its cold and rigid approach to raising imperial offspring. Sophie was born when Elizabeth was still a teenager. The Empress, barely more than a girl herself, was thrown into the public eye with little preparation and even less support. The joy she felt upon becoming a mother was quickly overshadowed by the overbearing presence of her mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie. From the moment the child was born, Elizabeth found herself pushed aside. The Archduchess insisted on naming the child after herself, claiming she knew best what was proper for an imperial heir. Elizabeth was not allowed to participate in any meaningful decisions about the baby's care. A team of nurses and doctors, chosen by the court and supervised by Sophie, was responsible for the infant's daily life. The young empress was treated not as a mother but as a figurehead, expected to smile and pose for portraits while her child was raised by others. The relationship between Elizabeth and her mother-in-law became increasingly strained as Sophie asserted her dominance over the household. The empress was made to feel incompetent, too young, and emotional to be entrusted with her children. When Elizabeth and Franz Joseph embarked on a trip to Hungary, they brought their 2 daughters, Sophie and the younger Gisela, with them. During this trip, both children fell ill, likely with dysentery or typhus, though the exact cause was never firmly established. Despite the best efforts to treat them, the elder daughter, Sophie, died suddenly and without warning. This loss broke Elizabeth in ways that were not immediately visible, but that would resurface throughout her life. The death of her daughter, combined with the feeling that she had been powerless to protect her, devastated her spirit. She blamed herself for taking the children on the journey, while the court, led by the ever-critical Archduchess Sophie, implied that Elizabeth's recklessness had caused the child's death. The grief she experienced was compounded by guilt and shame, feelings that were only intensified by the lack of support and empathy from the Viennese court. After Sophie's death, Elizabeth fell into a deep depression. She became withdrawn and unwell, suffering from physical symptoms that mirrored her emotional collapse. Her appetite vanished, and she grew frail. The court, unable or unwilling to recognize her suffering as valid, treated her illness as a form of weakness. The Empress's desire to retreat, to escape the painful surroundings and judgments of court life, became more urgent. Her health crisis became a turning point, both in her life and in her relationship with her surviving children. Gisela, her second daughter, would grow up in the same stifling environment that had been so unbearable for Elizabeth. Yet unlike her mother, Gisela adapted to it. From a young age, she was raised according to strict Habsburg customs, separated emotionally and physically from her mother, and shaped to fulfill the role of a dutiful imperial daughter. The emotional distance that grew between them was not born out of indifference on Elizabeth's part, but from the trauma and helplessness she felt after being excluded from her children's lives. She was allowed only limited access to them, always under supervision, and was not permitted to influence their education or upbringing. Gisela, who had few memories of her mother's active presence in her early life, developed a temperament more in line with that of the court, a sense of duty, order, and reserve. This divergence only widened as Gisela grew older. While Elizabeth sought out freedom, solitude, and intellectual exploration, Gisela followed the path set for her by the empire. Their letters reveal a formality that rarely softened into warmth. Though there was affection, there was also misunderstanding. Elizabeth, who had yearned for a maternal closeness she was denied, could not find it with the daughter who had grown up in her absence. Gisela respected her mother, but did not share her worldview. She married a Bavarian prince and lived a conventional life, in stark contrast to her mother's restless wandering and philosophical musings. If the bond with Gisela was strained and distant, the connection between Elizabeth and her only son, Rudolf, was more intense, complex, and ultimately tragic. Rudolf was born into a world that already saw him as the future of the Habsburg dynasty. From the moment of his birth, he belonged not to his parents but to the state. Franz Joseph, who was conservative and militaristic, had clear ideas about what a crown prince should be: obedient, disciplined, and devoted to duty. Elizabeth, on the other hand, envisioned a different kind of future for her son. She wanted him to be educated broadly, to think critically, to feel deeply. In this vision, Elizabeth and Franz Joseph were fundamentally opposed. Elizabeth's influence on Rudolf was profound in his early years. She arranged for tutors who exposed him to liberal ideas, literature, and scientific inquiry. Under her direction, he developed a keen interest in biology, politics, and the natural sciences. But this intellectual nourishment was soon interrupted when Franz Joseph, alarmed by what he saw as softness or unsuitability in the boy, took control of his education. The liberal tutors were dismissed, replaced by military instructors. The young crown prince was subjected to brutal discipline and emotional isolation, designed to toughen him into a future emperor. This period of his life left lasting psychological scars. Despite this rupture, Elisabeth and Rudolf remained emotionally connected. They shared a deep curiosity about the world, a love of writing, and a shared sense of alienation within the court. Both felt misunderstood, suffocated by the ceremonial roles they were expected to play. Rudolf idolized his mother, not only for her beauty and intelligence, but for her defiance of the court that had hurt them both. He saw in her a kindred spirit, someone who also rejected the rigid mold of imperial life. Their relationship was marked by long letters, conversations filled with philosophical reflection, and a mutual yearning for authenticity. Yet their bond was not enough to shield Rudolf from his inner demons. As he entered adulthood, he struggled with political frustrations, a deteriorating marriage, and personal disillusionment. He found the imperial system outdated, its leaders unwilling to embrace reform. He grew increasingly critical of the military culture he had been forced into and increasingly sympathetic to liberal and nationalist movements that his father opposed. This tension with Franz Joseph grew into open conflict. Rudolf, like his mother, sought to live with intellectual and emotional honesty in a world that rewarded only obedience and control. His despair culminated in the infamous incident at Mayerling. In the winter of that year, Rudolf and his young mistress, Baroness Mary Vetsera, were found dead in a hunting lodge outside Vienna. The circumstances were quickly hushed by the imperial family, but it became clear that Rudolf had taken his own life and that of Mary in a suicide pact. The shock of this event reverberated across the empire. For Elizabeth, it was the final blow. The death of Rudolf was not only the loss of a child, but the shattering of the last emotional connection she had to her former self. He had embodied her hopes, her beliefs, her resistance to the court that had so wounded her. With his death, she withdrew almost completely from public life. She dressed only in black from that moment on, her face increasingly hidden from the world. Her travels, which had once been a means of escape, became permanent exile. She refused to sit for new portraits, to attend state events, or to play the part of empress. She wrote in her diary and poetry that she no longer felt alive, that her soul had died with her son. In this grief-stricken phase, Elizabeth's maternal identity evolved into a form of mourning that never ended. She had been denied the ability to raise her children, then punished emotionally for the distance that had been created without her consent. She had tried to be close to Rudolf, to nurture in him the values she cherished, but even that had ended in despair. Her relationship with motherhood became one of loss. First Sophie, then Rudolf, and in a different sense, Gisela too. Elizabeth's story, when viewed through the lens of her relationships with her children, is one of profound sorrow, powerlessness, and rebellion. She was a mother in name but rarely in function, a result of both her own temperament and the imperial system that saw royal children not as individuals to be loved, but as heirs to be shaped. The pain she experienced was not limited to the tragedies that befell her children. It extended to the daily absence, the lost moments, the intimacy that was never allowed to flourish. Through it all, Elizabeth turned inward. Her writings became darker, her reflections more philosophical. She read ancient texts, meditated on fate and death, and wrote poems that revealed her aching heart. She believed that her soul had been tested beyond what was bearable, and that her life was a series of farewells. Her fascination with Greek mythology, particularly figures like Achilles and Iphigenia, reflected her sense of sacrifice, her longing for purity, and her belief that beauty and suffering were inextricably linked. Her legacy as a mother is complicated. To some, she was distant, neglectful, too absorbed in her own pain to be present. To others, she was a victim of a system that denied her the most basic expressions of maternal love. What is clear is that Elizabeth's experience of motherhood was not one of joy and fulfillment, but of grief and rebellion. She loved deeply, but she could not protect. She yearned for closeness, but was always kept at a distance. In the end, the Empress, known for her elegance and mystery, was, at her core, a woman haunted by loss. Her maternal grief was not a single chapter in her life, but the thread that connected many of her most significant choices. From her early withdrawal from court, to her obsessive self-discipline, to her long periods of solitude, Each act was both an escape from pain and a response to it. Elizabeth of Austria remains one of history's most enigmatic figures not because of her titles, but because of her contradictions. She was both royal and rebel, mother and mourner, beauty and sorrow intertwined. Her children were not just heirs to a throne. They were, for her, symbols of both the life she longed for and the price she paid for her crown. Elizabeth of Austria, known to history as Empress Sisi, was a woman whose life unfolded beneath the heavy gaze of public scrutiny within the gilded but suffocating halls of imperial duty. From the moment she was thrust into the spotlight as the wife of Emperor Franz Joseph, Elizabeth found herself the unwilling subject of fascination and expectation. Her beauty was legendary, and it became both a symbol of her allure and a shield behind which she hid her discontent. But this beauty was not effortless nor incidental. It was the result of extreme dedication, a lifelong obsession, and a complex interplay of control, identity, and rebellion. In a life where so much was dictated to her by court protocol and dynastic demands, Elizabeth carved out one domain that was hers alone: her appearance. Within this carefully curated image, she found a fragile and often illusory form of agency. Elizabeth's reputation for beauty spread across Europe, rivaling that of any monarch or noblewoman of her age. Admirers marveled at her slender figure, her delicate features, and above all, her remarkable hair. It was said to be so long it touched the floor, a river of thick, chestnut brown that she wore in elaborate braids and coils. Her hair became one of her trademarks, but it was also the center of a demanding and time-consuming daily ritual. Each morning, her hairdresser spent several hours combing, washing, and arranging it, a task so tedious that Elizabeth would often grow irritable if it was not done to her liking. During these hours, silence was observed, and mirrors were used sparingly, as the Empress disliked looking at her reflection. This paradox, of someone devoted to beauty yet uncomfortable with her image, reflected the deep contradictions in Elizabeth's inner world. In addition to her hair care, Elizabeth adhered to a strict and punishing physical regimen. She was devoted to exercise in a way that was unusual, if not unprecedented, for women of her class and time. She had a gymnasium installed in her palace quarters, equipped with rings, bars, and other apparatus for calisthenics. She practiced daily, often pushing herself to exhaustion. She walked for hours, hiked in the mountains, and was an accomplished horsewoman who could outride nearly any man. She maintained her slim figure through these exertions and through a diet that bordered on starvation. On many days, she subsisted on milk, oranges, or broth. She avoided meat, and at times reportedly fasted altogether. Her waist was kept shockingly small with the use of corsets that were tightened to extremes, evidence of both discipline and self-denial. To many, these routines may appear to be symptoms of vanity. And while Elizabeth was not immune to the pressures of public admiration, her beauty practices were far more than a desire to be adored. They were, in essence, a coping mechanism. In a life where she had little say over her environment, her schedule, or her role, her body became the one arena where she could exert absolute control. Every strand of hair, every inch of skin, every pound lost or kept off. These were not just aesthetic choices. They were declarations of willpower in the face of powerlessness. The Habsburg court offered Elizabeth the crown, but it denied her freedom. She was not allowed to raise her children. She had little influence in political matters. Her opinions were dismissed, and her spirit labeled as rebellious. She could not change her circumstances, but she could master herself. She once remarked that she would rather be a commoner and free than an empress encaged. This yearning for autonomy, for a life not dictated by imperial expectations, found expression in the rituals she created around her appearance. They were not only acts of self-maintenance, but symbolic gestures of resistance. In controlling her body, Elizabeth was trying to reclaim her selfhood. Her obsession with beauty was also a form of escapism. By focusing on the external, she could avoid the pain that dwelt within. Her routines gave her structure in a life that felt otherwise hollow. They allowed her to drown out sorrow with repetition, to numb despair with discipline. In this way, beauty became a form of meditation, one that offered her momentary relief from the grief, isolation, and frustration that defined much of her experience as empress. But this pursuit was also a mask, a carefully maintained facade that concealed Elizabeth's inner turmoil. The world saw a radiant empress, forever youthful and alluring. They saw portraits painted with star-like diadems, gowns adorned with silk and lace, a figure of elegance and mystique. What they did not see was the profound sadness behind the gaze, the relentless anxiety that accompanied her efforts, the way her rituals were born not of joy but of necessity. Her public image, so meticulously curated, was a shield against vulnerability. She feared the gaze of the world, not because she was shy, but because she knew that the image they adored had little to do with the woman she truly was. This disconnect between the outer image and the inner reality grew as Elisabeth aged. After the age of 30, she refused to be photographed or painted. She did not want to be seen aging. She feared that her beauty, which had become her symbol, would fade and that with it, her only real source of identity would disappear. She began to carry fans and parasols to obscure her face in public, avoiding mirrors, cameras, and the company of strangers. Her hair routines became even more demanding, her diet more rigid, her exercise more obsessive. She was chasing a version of herself that could never be caught, an idealized image frozen in time, while the real woman continued to change, to suffer, and to age. Her pursuit of beauty was not a celebration of self-love. It was a response to the expectations placed on her by society and her own desperate need to hold on to something unchanging in a world that had denied her constancy. The Empress did not find freedom in being admired. On the contrary, the more she was praised for her looks, the more imprisoned she became by them. She feared that once her beauty faded, she would be nothing. The attention it brought was not empowering but suffocating, a daily reminder that she was being valued not for her mind or her heart, but for how well she conformed to the romantic ideal projected onto her. Yet Elisabeth was far from superficial. She was deeply intellectual, well-read, and fluent in several languages. She immersed herself in literature and philosophy, corresponded with poets and scholars, and wrote extensively in secret. Her poetry often revealed the depth of her despair, her alienation, and her thoughts on mortality. Her writings, largely hidden during her lifetime, show a woman who saw through the illusions of court life and yearned for meaning beyond its confines. But this inner world was kept apart from the one she presented publicly. The Empress with perfect hair and flawless skin was a character she performed, while the real Elisabeth remained behind the curtain, speaking only through poems and in private letters. This dichotomy, between appearance and reality, between image and truth, defined her existence. It was reflected not only in her beauty rituals, but also in the places she chose to inhabit. Elisabeth was rarely at court. She traveled constantly, seeking out remote places where she could be alone. She visited spas, forests, mountaintops, and islands. In Greece, she built the Achillean, a palace inspired by her favorite mythological hero, Achilles. It was not only a tribute to strength and heroism, but also to vulnerability. She saw herself in Achilles, not just in his glory, but in his pain, in the knowledge of his mortality. Her palace was adorned with statues, poems, and symbols of ancient Greece, a world she saw as more noble, more sincere than her own. It was, in essence, another form of escape, this time not into physical perfection, but into mythology, into history, into a time and place untouched by her present suffering. Elisabeth's lifelong pursuit of beauty and her equally intense desire to escape were two sides of the same coin. Both were attempts to assert control in a life where decisions were made for her, to find meaning in a world that often felt empty, and to construct an identity on her terms, even if that identity was rooted in illusion. She did not want to be an empress, yet she could not cease being one. She did not want to be watched, yet she could not escape the gaze. And so she made herself into something ethereal, untouchable, almost mythical. She became a symbol instead of a person, a vision instead of a presence. This transformation came at great cost. Her relationships suffered. Her children, particularly her daughter Gisela and son Rudolph, experienced her not as a constant maternal figure, but as a distant and troubled soul. Her marriage to Franz Joseph, though rooted in mutual respect, lacked intimacy. He loved her deeply, but never truly understood her. And she, for her part, could not give herself fully to someone who represented the very system that confined her. Even in the rare moments of connection, Elisabeth kept a part of herself guarded, hidden behind her long hair, her flawless skin, her carefully chosen words. In the end, the beauty that made her a legend became a wall that separated her from the world. It protected her, but it also isolated her. The woman who was admired by millions died feeling unseen. Her assassination in Geneva, by a man who did not even know her name until moments before the attack, was a cruel irony. She had spent her life trying to disappear, trying to be more than an object of fascination, only to be killed for being what she had tried so hard not to be, a symbol of royalty, an emblem of the state. Her death shocked Europe. The image of the Empress, veiled and modest, walking alone by a lakeside moments before her assassination, stood in stark contrast to the grandeur she had once embodied. The world mourned the loss of its fairy tale empress. But for those who looked deeper, her passing marked the end of a life spent searching for selfhood beneath layers of expectation and sorrow. Her body, once sculpted and adorned to perfection, became at last free from the rituals and routines that had both empowered and imprisoned her. Elizabeth's legacy is complex. She is remembered as one of the most beautiful women of her era, a romantic figure who lived in castles and rode through misty forests. But behind that image was a woman who suffered deeply, who wrestled with the constraints of gender, class, and tradition. Her beauty was real, but it was also a construct, a response to trauma, a bid for control, a cry for help disguised as perfection. In her story, one sees the peril of mistaking appearances for truth, of valuing women more for how they look than for who they are. Her relentless pursuit of beauty was never about vanity. It was about survival. In a world that denied her voice, she spoke with her body. In a life where she had no power, she found it in discipline. And in reality, she could not bear it. She built a fantasy, one braid, one corset, 1 hour of silence at a time. Elizabeth of Austria did not live happily ever after. But she did live with courage, with longing, and with a kind of tragic grace that still echoes through history. Her life, seen through the prism of her beauty, becomes not a story of admiration, but of understanding, an invitation to look beyond the facade, to see the woman beneath the crown, and to recognize in her struggle the universal human desire. Elizabeth of Austria, the empress who captivated an empire and beyond, lived not the life of grandeur and stability that her title might suggest, but one of restlessness, isolation, and unfulfilled longing. From the outside, her existence appeared gilded, a world of palaces, ballrooms, and exquisite portraits capturing a beauty that defied time. Yet at the heart of this legend was a woman deeply uncomfortable in her role, profoundly disillusioned by court life, and persistently haunted by a desire for escape. Her lifelong journey across Europe and beyond was not merely for leisure or spectacle. It was a search for something more elusive than any destination, a search for meaning, freedom, and peace of mind. From an early age, Elizabeth resisted the constraints of formality and the expectations placed upon her. Raised in Bavaria among forests, lakes, and a family that valued a degree of personal freedom unusual for royalty, she grew up with a strong connection to nature, poetry, and solitude. The young duchess who ran barefoot through the woods would later find herself bound by imperial duties in the court of Vienna, where her individuality was suppressed in favor of protocol and tradition. The contrast between her childhood and her new life as Empress of Austria was staggering. Almost overnight, she was transformed from an independent, spirited girl into a ceremonial figure expected to conform to the rigorous expectations of the Habsburg monarchy. That tension never eased. The role of Empress proved not only stifling, but deeply alienating. Elizabeth's personal freedoms were curtailed, her children taken from her care by her domineering mother-in-law, and her daily life regulated by the iron grip of the Viennese court. She quickly began to recoil from the formalities, appearing less and less frequently at public events and distancing herself from the suffocating rituals that defined her new existence. It was during these early years of marriage that her desire to flee began to manifest, not symbolically but physically. Her journeys away from the court were not casual trips, but deliberate and increasingly desperate acts of self-preservation. Initially, Elizabeth's travels were sanctioned and accompanied by court officials. She toured parts of the empire, fulfilling ceremonial duties with the grace and beauty that would make her a beloved figure among her subjects. But even in these early visits, there were signs that she felt more at home among ordinary people than in the palace. She connected with the Hungarian people in particular, eventually playing a key role in the Austro-Hungarian Compromise and earning the loyalty and admiration of many in the region. In Hungary, Elizabeth felt a measure of the acceptance and emotional warmth that had been denied to her in Vienna. She learned the Hungarian language, dressed in national costume, and found genuine camaraderie among the people and their leaders. However, these moments of belonging were rare. As time went on, Elizabeth withdrew more deeply into herself. Her travels became less about duty and more about avoidance. She often left Austria for long periods, traveling across Europe under assumed names, staying in remote hotels, on isolated islands, or in quiet spa towns. Her movements were unpredictable, even to her family and close staff. She would vanish for months, seeking places where she could walk unnoticed, read undisturbed, and simply be alone. Her reclusiveness, far from a mere eccentricity, was a way of preserving what remained of her inner world. The places she chose reflected her state of mind. In Bad Ischl, she found moments of calm in the natural beauty of the lakes and mountains. In Corfu, she built the Achillean, a palace named after her favorite mythological hero. She was captivated by the figure of Achilles, not only for his strength and beauty, but for his vulnerability and doomed fate. The palace, adorned with Greek statues and verses from ancient texts, was less a royal residence and more a temple of mourning, a place where she could immerse herself in literature, reflection, and the timeless tragedy of human suffering. These travels, often solitary and secretive, were Elizabeth's way of creating spaces that the court could not penetrate. In addition to her physical withdrawal, Elizabeth turned inward through her intellectual pursuits. She was a passionate reader, drawn to works of philosophy, poetry, and history. She read Shakespeare, Homer, and Heinrich Heine, whose melancholic and ironic verses deeply resonated with her. She filled notebooks with her poetry, writing in secret, expressing her despair, her disenchantment, and her philosophical musings about life, death, and the soul. These writings were rarely meant for public view. They were personal testaments, the only realm where she felt entirely free to be honest. Through her verses, she explored the futility of life at court, the grief that followed her everywhere, and her growing fascination with the idea of death as a final release. Her intellectual and physical isolation grew more pronounced with age. She became obsessed with privacy, refusing to sit for new portraits after the age of 30, avoiding cameras, mirrors, and any form of public exposure. She was no longer interested in sustaining the myth of the beautiful empress. Instead, she clung to it only as a shield behind which she could disappear. She wore black after the death of her son, Rudolph, not just as mourning, but as a permanent visual declaration of her detachment from the life she once led. The black clothing, the veils, and the lowered parasols became part of her identity, an emblem of her separation from the world, a statement of grief made visible. The tragedy of Rudolph's death marked a turning point from which Elizabeth never recovered. The crown prince had inherited her sensitivity and intellect, but also her melancholy and disillusionment. His suicide, alongside his lover Mary Vetsera at Mayerling, was a national scandal and a personal catastrophe. Elizabeth blamed herself, at least in part. The emotional bond they had shared, built on their shared sense of alienation, only deepened the wound. With his death, Elizabeth lost the last person in whom she saw a reflection of herself. Her mourning was not theatrical, it was total. From that moment on, she retreated even further from the public eye, her travels taking on an even more restless and haunted character. In Geneva, years later, Elizabeth walked along the lake as she had in so many other cities, an anonymous figure in dark clothing, trying to stay unnoticed. She had become a master of invisibility. She traveled under pseudonyms, avoided grand hotels, and insisted on no escort or security, refusing to acknowledge the dangers of the time. Her death, when it came, was as senseless and anonymous as the life she had tried to live in her later years. An Italian anarchist named Luigi Licini, intent on killing a royal as a political statement, found Elizabeth instead. She was not his intended target, but she was a convenient one. He stabbed her with a sharpened file. At first, she appeared unhurt, standing and walking for several minutes before collapsing. Only later did they realize the wound had pierced her heart. Her assassination was a cruel and tragic end for a woman who had spent decades trying to disappear. In death, she was once again thrust into the limelight she had long avoided. The world mourned the beautiful empress, remembered the myth, but not always the woman. Newspapers printed romantic tributes. Artists painted mournful tributes. But few truly understood the depth of her suffering, the nature of her escape, or the meaning behind her lifelong wandering. Elizabeth's legacy is one of contradictions. She was admired for her grace, yet lived in constant sorrow. She was envied for her beauty, yet saw it as a burden. She held one of the highest positions in Europe, yet felt powerless and voiceless. Her life was filled with the trappings of wealth and influence, yet she craved simplicity, nature, and truth. Her rejection of court life, her refusal to conform, her pursuit of intellectual and physical freedom. These were acts of quiet rebellion, not against a single person, but against a system that turned individuals into symbols and stripped them of their humanity. She did not fit the mold of a traditional monarch. She was not an empress who ruled through policy or diplomacy. Her reign was one of the inner worlds, of thoughts, of feelings, of dreams. She inspired not because she governed, but because she resisted. She stood apart not through strength of rule, but through strength of spirit. Her legacy lives on in the questions she posed simply by living as she did. What does it mean to be free? Can one find peace in a world built on illusion? What is the cost of being true to oneself when the world demands performance? Even today, Elizabeth fascinates. Her life has inspired films, books, and endless interpretations. Yet perhaps the most truthful tribute one can give her is not to celebrate the myth, but to understand the woman who lived behind it. A woman who wandered not for adventure, but for survival. Who sought not applause, but quiet. Who longed not for grandeur, but for something far more elusive, a place to belong. Did she ever find that place? Perhaps not in the world as it was. But in the poetry she wrote, in the paths she walked alone, in the silent companionship of ancient texts and solitary seas, she carved out fragments of freedom. And perhaps in those fleeting moments, on a mountaintop in Bavaria, on a horse in the Hungarian countryside, or beneath the olive trees of Corfu, Elizabeth found, however briefly, the peace she had sought for so long. Her story is not one of triumph, nor is it one of complete tragedy. It is a story of complexity, of yearning, of resistance. It reminds us that not all prisons have bars, and not all crowns are made of gold. Some are woven from expectation, silence, and sorrow. And some, like Elizabeth's, are worn by those who never asked for them and who spent their lives trying to lay them down.